Hi, I'm Sae Ra Germaine, the Deputy CEO of CAVAL, and I'm coming to you from beautiful Naarm, Melbourne. And this is CAVAL Shelf Matters podcast. I'd like to firstly introduce Sebastian Hammer from Index Data. Tell me a bit about yourself and how did you get here?
First of all, hi, Sarah, and thank you for having me. This is really exciting. So I um, have been around libraries and library technology for the past 35 years or so. I began my journey as a technologist, I suppose you'd say. I think like a lot of people my age, became interested in computers when I was sort of in my teens in the 80s, when there was a craze of these little microcomputers that you could plug into your TV. And just before PCs became a thing, a lot of us were just learning to code on these things. And I think I always had a little bit of a quirky sense of computers and programming as a kind of self-expression more than anything else. I grew up around my mom was a painter, and our house was always full of musicians and artists and writers and such. And I always felt a little bad that I didn't really have a thing that I could do to express myself in that way. And computers were like that for me. And I would tell my mom that, hey, computers are like my form of art. Um, and I knew that I was onto something because it annoyed the heck out of her. She could not sort of fathom the idea of something that mediated by technology being an art form. But to me, it really felt like a form of self-expression. And then because I had that interest, I studied computer science in college for a while. And I I wasn't really that interested in a lot of the theory, but I was very taken with computer networking and especially sort of what it looked like to make one piece of software talk to another piece of software. Whenever I'd read a textbook about operating system design, as one does, I would like skip to the part where they talk about network buffers because I just thought that stuff was so cool. And that kind of pulled me sideways into a a community that was really big on college campuses at the end of the 80s around multi-user text adventure games. They were called multi-user dungeons. And I became really taken with these things and I started to wonder if I could make one. And so I ended up starting a project to build one of these things. And we became a little group and we kind of taught each other. We were applying what we had been learning from about project management at night, kind of secretively building this software, and it became sort of popular. And we released this as open source software, and it ended up getting picked up by a bunch of other people. And I got this sort of early experience of working within a community and of putting software that I'd written out there and seeing people's response to it. And that I think informed a lot of how I have come to technology in the years after that. And it was from that experience I eventually one day found a job ad. I was looking for work. I was looking for some extra money, and I found a job ad for a thing called the Danish National Library Authority. This was all taking place in Copenhagen in Denmark. And I had never really thought that seriously about working with software or computers as a profession. Like I was really just there because I had that interest in programming. And I had never really given that much thought to what my career would look like. But I picked up this job as a student worker, and it turned out that they were looking for somebody who knew about network programming. And they asked me in the interview, so do you had any experience? And I said, well, no, except I made this game and I really like that kind of stuff. And it happened that there was a person on the hiring committee who was like, I know that person's game. We
That's
should hire him
fantastic.
to work on the thing. And so I was hired on the spot and immediately dropped into building national infrastructure for resource sharing for Danish libraries. And I was just stuck. And that's been like now right about 35 years. So it was a little bit of a quirky kind of route, but a lot of it was just I've always had just a real love for seeing what happens when you get software, especially software written by different people talking together. I just think that's endlessly fun and cool.
Yeah, it's interesting because I sort of reflected back on my sort of tech career and I ended up in libraries very similar to yourself, where I ended up in resource sharing. And it was more about how people and systems talk to each other and how they can do it seamlessly if they talk in an open and, I guess, honest way, right? Because this is exactly what I need. This is the time that we need it. And it's very similar to your story, right? And but I hated the network development side of things. I hated development. I just love the community and the interoperability. But that's kind of cool that we've had quite a similar, I guess, journey through IT into libraries.
Yeah, and I'd have to say, I think one of the things that blew me away working sort of in a government agency that built that kind of infrastructure, and we talked about the standards and we talked about what technology needed to do uh, to support libraries and librarians. And a lot of other technologists hated the human part, hated sort of that whole conversational space that took around. They were just like, "Hey, tell me what to do, and I'll make the computer do it." But there was something deeply fascinating about people getting together to figure out what is it that we're trying to accomplish in this very complicated sociological and organizational system of different organizations that are still trying to collaborate and figure out how they can support each other and still remain independent. And that conversation and the conversation between those people and the software, I think is really fascinating. Like, how do you, like, as a developer, um, it just seemed to open up these dimensions to technology that if you just sit in a room and you write to a set of specs or you write for yourself, or you become, it's a little bit isolated, right? The
Yeah.
technology piece can be lonely, and I never really liked that part.
Yeah.
The part where you're doing it with other people is just deeply inspiring.
And I think that's the kind of cool bit of the open source world, right? Is that you get to meet people of all different shapes, sizes, and coding capabilities. And it was a big part of my life and shaped the way that I sort of live my values and the way that I select things and the way and the people that I spend my time with. Is that why you sort of headed down the open source route yourself?
It's funny, open source just sort of seemed like something you naturally fell into because if you are in an academic environment, it's kind of the place that you just sort of go. There's so much of the technology that floats around in a purely academic library that's open source. I think it's heavily influenced by the idea that research is something that you share. There's a dialogue that takes place. And I found as I was using other people's software, that I had a sort of connection to those people. As I was putting my own software out there, it's a way to express an opinion and to put an idea out there. And I started to find over time that you can have a tremendous amount of impact on the world around you by putting open source software out there. And I came at one point to think about it as like, okay, well, and this goes back a little bit to my argument with my mom about whether this is an art form or not, that there's a kind of sort of narrow, there's a kind of storytelling that goes into software
Yeah.
where you write a piece of software, you think about how it's going to be received. What's going to be the experience of the person unpacking this software? What will they feel? And I became really kind of taken with the idea of open source software as a form of storytelling and exchanging ideas. And then over time, it became just the way that I sort of operated in the world and formed relationships with other people. It's this really neat way of having connections with people and being in the world. And it's really good for introverts, right? If you're not necessarily comfortable going up to somebody and saying, hey, let's talk about something, you can put some software out there and it might start a conversation.
Putting your code out there can be quite vulnerable because it's not the easiest space to put your code out there because coders tend to be quite judgmental sometimes. Sorry to all my coder friends, but it you're putting yourself out there and your style and the way that you do things. It's an interesting space to go into.
These days, I don't get to write as much code myself as I used to. That's an exaggeration. I get to write no code today, but um, I remember in the early days, people would look at my code and going, "Oh, this is easy. This is like really easy code to read. I like this." This is very clear, and it became sort of my style. I liked code that was very literal. Like I wasn't interested in tricks to shorten things. I was interested in code that was readable and that told a story about what it was doing. You go from the code that you write as a singular developer to the conversation that you're having with other people. If you're lucky and your code gets picked up and some people come to you and say, "Hey, let's do a project together." And all of a
Yes.
sudden, you're not just writing this code for yourself, you're writing this code into the context of a community of people that are bringing different things to the table, sitting in the room with people, trying to figure out how we solve big problems together. And that is just really inspiring. And maybe that's ultimately one of the things that kind of gets me, that really locks me into open source software as a brilliant way to be in the world as a developer, that you get to be in those kinds of conversations if you're lucky.
Yeah, that's really cool. And I guess moving on to index data a little bit, you've managed to pull together a whole team of amazing people that believe in what you do and the communities that you're building and working with. How did you start index data and what do they do to support libraries?
Mm. Um, so I've been working for the Danish government for 4 years or so, and as I said, I just loved it to pieces. Like I was so in that. I liked the spirit of it because it felt oriented towards building infrastructure for libraries. I liked the mindset of working for a government agency that happened to be like, it had a really nice spirit. As these things happened, eventually that office was restructured and absorbed into another agency, and it lost some of the spirit that I had come to love. And so I started Index Data with a friend. And when I look back, it seems pretty clear that really what we were trying to do was to recreate the spirit of that government office where we had met each other. We never talked about profits or growing the company or building equity or those types of things. And I think in part because both of us had technical backgrounds, we didn't know anything about running a business. We didn't make any money for the first year. We just wrote code. We put some software out there. We were hired early on by people who had known us from our previous job to work on some collaborative projects. And we wrote some software and we decided that we would release the software as open source software. And our thinking was that if we put it out there, then somebody might come to us and help us and ask us to do something on that software, right? It might get
Yeah.
our name out there. It might be like a little bit of a calling card we would put out in the world that might lead to something. And we couldn't really see having a conventional sales organization for a vended software product. We didn't know anything about doing that. We had no background whatsoever for thinking about marketing and sales in the normal way. So open source software was a way for us to just get out there. And because we were somewhat comfortable in our minds with having a bit of a elastic, a rubber band between putting software out there and making money. That kind of worked. And when I look back, I also realized that part of that was because our wives had jobs. For years, I would say, for the first many years, we were just about the only commercial company that was doing this as a thing, that was making open source software and giving it to libraries and hoping that something good would come from it. And later on, that would become more of a thing, but index data always kind of stood out a little bit. And for the first decade of our existence, I was very confused by this. Like I would look at what we were doing And I just didn't really understand how to conceptualize it or to think about it, because
Yeah.
it seemed very oddball. It was just the thing we did, and we were happy doing it, but I couldn't really sort of conceptualize what it meant for us to be a business doing that sort of thing. And we did become sort of well known as people who build infrastructure for libraries or technology infrastructure for libraries. We made these open source tools. We had a focus on interoperability and network connectivity between libraries because that was stuff that we really liked.
Yeah.
And over time we developed, because of our history, because at some point we had suddenly been in the marketplace doing this thing for 20 years, we started to build up sort of a network of people who knew us or who had used our software, sometimes like 10 years or 15 years back. And so the projects became bigger and more elaborate and more
Yeah.
socially complex until eventually, about 10 years ago, we were the lead technical partner behind developing the Folio Library Services platform, together with a group of academic libraries and with EBSCO Information Services in the US. We were getting together a project to kind of try to respond to some of the consolidation in the library technology marketplace. It started with having a fascination with the space between libraries and interoperability between systems and how you create collaborative infrastructure without necessarily being dependent on a centralized organization.
And it's quite cool because I first came across index data, it would have been around probably 2017, I want to say. And it was right when Folio was just really starting to sort of spread its message. And Peter Murray came out to Australia, and we had a whole, what is the impact of open source in libraries kind of conversation. And at the time, I was all in. Like open source was it for me. And it was great to finally see something out there that all of us could contribute to. And it was telling a bigger story. But I think for us in Australia, it was just a little bit too early. We were not quite ready to have conversations around, you know, data stewardship and data sovereignty. And, you know, we want to be able to take control over the systems that we run, not necessarily the other way around. We were sort of in the mindset of, let's just pass on the responsibility to someone else. They will build it for us and we'll let them have it. Um, but I think that's slowly coming back now, as we're realizing that maybe we do need to know what is happening to our data once it gets into a system, what happens when we want to take it out. Are you seeing that shift in mindset in the US as well, or has it always been there?
I think there are different kind of driving forces here, but one of them is there's been a trend towards consolidation in the marketplace. When I
Yeah,
started working in libraries, there was an ecology of small companies and mid-sized companies kind of doing their thing, and there was a degree of competition, and there was what I would think about as a marketplace of ideas more than anything else, right? So there was
yeah,
a bunch of people that are engaging with their customers that show up at conferences and share ideas and try new things out. And then we started to see the formation of sort of some big centers of gravity around large organizations that started acquiring other organizations. And you started to see private equity organizations come in and say, hey, this seems like good, steady revenue coming out of these libraries. Let's get in on this action. And you started to see these centers of gravity getting picked up by private equity. And at first, I think everybody were like, well, this is great. These larger companies can do more R&D. They will have more power to help libraries take advantage of the cloud. This is a good thing for libraries. It's the sign of a mature marketplace that we have this dynamic. And uh, I've just by constitution never felt super comfortable with any kind of aggregation of power or control over things. And I think what resonates for me, what I feel like I see is that A, when you have fewer players in the marketplace, that makes the marketplace of ideas die down. There are fewer
Yes.
ideas floating around when you have a smaller number of organizations. And I honestly feel like, and I'm curious where that conversation sits in Australia for you, but there is an increasing awareness in the US, I feel, that the concentration of power amongst a small number of organizations, both in libraries, but maybe especially outside, I'm thinking about Facebook and Google and Twitter and those
Yes.
types of companies, that's not necessarily great.
No.
That has some side effects, and I feel a little bit like we were starting to see libraries getting sucked into a battle for who could have the biggest walled garden, who could
Yep.
have the biggest, it became super easy to collaborate with other libraries as long as they were on the same product as you were for e-resource management or resource sharing or whatever you
Yep.
have, right? But collaboration between those platforms became harder.
Yes.
Conversations about standards and interoperability started to die down because the vendors would be like, don't worry about that stuff. We'll deal with how you can share information with other libraries as long as they're also our customers. So you start to get
Yes.
that sort of platform effect where you very rapidly you get a lot of power accruing to the people who have the biggest walled garden. And I think that there is a sense of alarm at that direction and worry that if you end up with just a single vendor, then that's not great from just about any perspective. Like there's so many ways that can go wrong. And I saw the interest in Folio, that what I experienced in the conversations with people was like, this is really great. It is great to have an alternative path, an alternative voice. And it almost feels to me like the interest in open source and open infrastructure, both in libraries and maybe more broadly in academia and beyond in government services, is about seeing that it's not great if we let a small number of commercial companies that aren't necessarily sort of accountable to our interests own what amounts to
Yes.
foundational infrastructure. Um, so it may be that we have seen some of the sort of ill effects a little bit sooner in the US. The US also is super different than almost anywhere else that I've worked in my life, in that it lacks a central government-owned infrastructure or governance structure for libraries. So American libraries are kind of going it alone, and they're making up their own structures and consortial collaborations and such. And that's a totally different dynamic as well.
Yeah, and that's interesting. And I guess that sort of leads me to talking about national infrastructure. And I mean, you started in national infrastructure for resource sharing, and you and I both worked on Project Reshare and implementing that in Australia as a national piece of infrastructure. And it's quite rare to see national infrastructure go so open source. Usually there's bits that are open source, but generally you know, it it's sort of tied off into one of the big proprietary systems. And it's actually quite amazing that Australia's been able to achieve an open source rollout like that. Is that something of significance that Australia should be celebrating more, or is it being noticed overseas? I guess that's one of the questions.
Um, I think it is absolutely worth celebrating. I think that one of the mechanisms that is not helping us in terms of trying to sort of avoid the universe collapsing into a couple of different technology singularities or whatever is that for big government infrastructure projects, it seems to me that, as you say, there is a tendency for them to go very safe and to say, let's
Yes.
go with a big commercial solution, because if we do that, even if it goes wrong, nobody can blame us. And it feels to me that Trove took a risk in some sense
Yes.
by going against that trend. Nobody could ever have faulted them if they had gone with a big commercial provider and it had gone poorly, right? But they really kind of took a leap of faith on the communities behind this software. And also, I think on the idea of interoperability and openness facilitated by open standards. Like the
Yes.
thing that really blew me away and that has ended up shaping the experience that we've had working together on the rollout is just the commitment to the standards and to say
Yes.
we want to have this system governed by open standards. And that felt like that was big and I think really important and worthy of celebration. I think people definitely noticed that the National Library of Australia, the Trove, picked an open source project rather than one of the big players,
Yes.
because there is a way in which an open source project is a way to kind of rekindle the marketplace of ideas by creating a space where libraries can work together and talk about how they want this stuff to be. It is a way to establish co-ownership of technology. And that in itself, I feel like, is a response to the kind of consolidation in the marketplace. But there's also a way in which the project becomes an entity of its own, right? And the
Yes.
project Reshare in this case sits alongside these commercial alternatives. And it really matters if a national library picks that direction. It was a sent shockwaves through the marketplace when the Library of Congress in the US and the National Library
Yes.
of Australia in Australia both picked Folio. That's a
Yeah.
big deal. And I can say with some certainty that it makes the other players stop and take notice. And I think it also, and this is a good thing, it changes their behavior a little bit.
Yes.
It might make them talk more about openness or inclusivity or engagement or accountability than they would otherwise, because now they've got to contend with this entity out there that is not just a competing product, but a competing idea about how a product should be accountable to its users.
Australia is a relatively small country when it comes to the just the sheer count of libraries, right? And I know from colleagues that I've spoken to that they find it quite frustrating sometimes when they're putting in a suggestion to one of the system vendors for an enhancement and it goes to a vote. And there's no way that an Australian context enhancement will ever get voted up because they're competing against thousands in the US. But the cool thing about Trove and Reshare was that it sort of leveled the playing field that anyone could play with us as long as it was in an open way and followed the standard. And we're now happily working with, other vendors and we're all talking the same language. Messages are going backwards and forwards. Sure, it started off a little bit clunky, but we're actually working towards a neater way of doing it. But it's actually kind of cool that it's, like I said, leveled that playing field and anyone can share their resources.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah.
What the standards do, and for me, open standards and open source software have always had this kind of interesting sort of mutually supportive relationship. Both of them, I think, are fundamentally about creating more open ecosystems, more open marketplaces of ideas. And what we enable in Australia by leaning into the standards is the idea that anyone can come and build a workflow tool, either as part of a library management system or standalone that can plug into the national infrastructure. The national infrastructure might change over time. You could replace the software. You could replace Reshare as a central component and replace it with something else that implements the standard better in the future. And the
Yeah.
underlying shape of those interactions will still be the same. Who knows what Australian libraries might look like or how they might choose to work together in 20 years. But this same digital infrastructure could very well still support those needs. And it's worth just adding to that the influence kind of goes in both directions. So there's a way in which a national solution can have a real impact downstream on how industry behaves. And then the
Yes.
other piece is, I know for a fact that there is a lot of excitement in the reshare community that this has happened, that Trove has, with CAVAL and with index data, have rolled out this solution based on Project Reshare, right? And people want to learn from that. People want to figure out
Yes.
what is the best way for us to work together in the future. And I would also say that you guys in Australia now have options in terms of how you engage. To what
Yes.
extent do you engage directly? To what extent might you find yourself with, in the future, an ecology or sort of an ecosystem of different developers or different vendors coming together to build solutions to fit into this open infrastructure? There's just a way in which the trend towards consolidation and monopolies in technology that we see, right? The internet
Yeah.
is increasingly collapsing into this handful of billionaire-run horrible
Exactly. Yeah.
companies. There's a counter trend, there's a counter story that we can tell when we leverage open source communities and open standards to build infrastructure. And I
Eh,
would say, for my money, Trove has been a real thought leader here.
Yeah, and it's quite awesome to think that we're having that sort of impact on the world, right? Because we're usually just this little tiny country in the corner that, like I said before, we kind of just put up with what we're given. But we wanted to take advantage of open source to make it ours and to make our voices heard and for us to be able to contribute in our own way. Um, and I mean, that project is the most fun IT project I've ever worked on, right? And like you said, the Trove team has brought this excited energy. I mean, even the day that we managed to work out that we could send emojis through ISO 18626 messages to a vendor was just sheer joy. And to be able to see that joy in a project like that is actually quite rare. And I've appreciated every bit of it. Um, but I'm going to take a little bit of a slant where some of these vendors are often, you know, treating open source as terrible. They're flaky, they're unsecure, they're disorganized. It's bad for democracy. You should just join us because we will look after you and, we will take responsibility of your stuff. What would you say to that? Yeah.
I mean, first of all, I mean, there's a lot to unpack. I've never fully understood the idea that open source software could be bad for democracy. But if I think about it as a whole, I think that their open source software, first of all, let's just be clear that open source is a type of software license, right?
Yeah.
Software doesn't really know that it's open source or not. It's not going to be inherently any more or less flaky because it has a certain type of license attached to it. I think that it is probably more important to look at the social structure surrounding the software than the type of
Yes.
license. But there certainly are plenty of commercial entities that are flaky or unreliable in various ways. And we've
Yes.
seen plenty of security or privacy issues associated with quite large technology companies. So I don't think that the software license is nearly as important as the social structure. What has happened organically with Koha since it came out of New Zealand and with more deliberately formed communities like Folio is that we're trying to reset that whole structure and that dynamic and saying we want to have real influence on the direction of this technology. If we're going to have software that is going to be central to the operation of our organization or to the way that we collaborate with others, if we want to have what eventually amounts to public infrastructure,
Yeah.
The mechanisms that bind libraries together and allows them to serve the needs of their patrons. I'm not saying that infrastructure necessarily has to be owned by the public, but there has to be accountability. And I think
Yes.
that in the current sort of technology space and the way that we manage the relationship between customers of technology, customers of cloud-hosted platforms, there's something that's lost in terms of the co-ownership and the accountability to the people that are making themselves dependent on those platforms, right? Anything mediated by technology, I feel like our sort of sense, our sense of what is right in terms of accountability and responsibility to between the providers of infrastructure and the users is just way out of whack. And that has to
Yes.
change. And I think so my perception has become that these types of communities, more than anything else, is about trying to reset those expectations a little bit. So I think that open source and open source communities are good for democracy. And I think that you have to look at the organizations and the actual kind of behavior of the technology, the software in the real world, and the license itself is not important.
What should we be asking of our vendors then? But should we be demanding more? Should we be questioning more? What should we be asking as well? Because sometimes, because we don't understand the tech, or we might not necessarily understand the monolith, how should we be asking questions and what should we be asking?
That's a great question. Um, I think that it is very nearly impossible for us as individuals or for individual libraries to sort of take a stance and say, these are this is the set of concerns I have. This is what I need to ask my vendor for. There are a couple of things that can help here. One is I think that standards are actually incredibly important for this. If there is a set of standards that you can ask for, and that might be standards that reflect anything from interoperability and open interfaces to a commitment to keeping data open and setting boundaries around what the vendor can and cannot do with your data as a library. Get a group of libraries, or even the National Library, or Trove, or somebody else together and say, let us put together a code of conduct, a definition of what we mean by accountability. And what I would be looking for more broadly is what I'd like to see is that if there is a company that wishes to provide a public space, whether that means storing data or managing transactions on behalf of libraries or managing the collections of libraries or even being part of the supply chain for libraries, I would
Yeah.
expect a certain level of accountability to the public and to the libraries that are using the software. I think that there is, if you want to talk about a threat to democracy, and this is maybe venting a little bit coming from somebody living in the United States right now, the biggest threat to democracy, to my mind, would be libraries losing their ability to act independently because we might see in our societies, in our democracies, forces emerging that want to, like, say, abuse patron data in some fashion
Yes.
to single out or profile individuals. It is not hard to imagine a government or political forces that want to control the kinds of information or knowledge that we have access to. When I started work in libraries, we talked about libraries being a pillar of democracy. And it was
Yes.
always it was like a cliche. It was just a thing we said, right? We like libraries because they are a pillar of democracy. But of course, that to me feels a little more real these days
Mm.
because whether you're talking about people's access to trusted information or you're talking about leveling the playing field between the people who have a lot and the people who don't have much, libraries play a completely unique role, and they have always been a little bit funny as public organizations because they tend to be independent. They tend to plug into their local context, whether they are a town, a public library, or a university library. And I think that's important. And I think that's worth preserving, right? So one way that you can preserve that is to try to avoid becoming dependent on some monolithic upstream source of all of your infrastructure and automation and your content. Um, and it is hard. But
Yes.
the mechanisms that I have seen that can work would be if everybody in their procurement, when they're buying a new system, goes out and asks for, hey, I want to understand, what are you going to do with my data? Uh,
Yeah.
I don't want you to do this, this, and this other thing. How do I get influence on the roadmap? What are my options for influencing the direction of this software? What happens when I want to leave?
Mm.
And that becomes a lot easier if there are some standards, if there are some well-defined documents that you can refer to, so libraries don't have to make it up. They can just say, "Hey, I want you to do the things that it says in that document over there."
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because like I said before, data sovereignty is very important to us, and we very much stipulate that data shouldn't be going across borders because we no longer can control who has access to our data once it leaves our borders. And becomes it becomes a very political issue once it does start leaving our borders, and we don't necessarily have control over that. But I guess bringing it back to a little bit more exciting things around Caval and index data. Like we sort of came together as this weird partnership. Um, and partnerships are super important to Caval in the way that we value the partnerships that we go into. We don't just go into them for funsies. We make sure that it's with our values and helps make the world just that little bit of a better place. And because we don't go into it lightly, it makes us appreciate the people that we do work with and the organizations and the friendships and the collegiality that we do get out of it. So how do you go and find the right partners? Like, and I might be a little bit selfish here and ask, why did you decide to go with Caval? Because you could have gone and tendered for the Trove solution by yourselves. But what made this partnership work for you to go, yes, we should do that?
Because as much as we can idealize the relationships between two organizations and a network of organizations, when it comes right down to it, it seems to me that it's ultimately always about the people. I saw something, I think it was a LinkedIn post recently lamenting the death of conferences, but I don't buy that. My sense is that they are still incredibly important because people go there primed to learn new things, and there's a certain energy that is particular to a conference where you can offer up an idea and people are way more likely to be like, yeah, right, that's a cool idea. Let me play
Yeah,
with that idea in a way that you might not do in your everyday life. Where somebody brings you an idea and you're like, that is annoying. I don't want to wrap my head around that idea. But at a conference, that's like the whole deal. And so I feel like that has done so much for me in terms of establishing working relationships, in terms of getting inspiration, in terms of fomenting partnerships between people that ultimately led to partnerships between organizations. Um, I think that in the case of our relationship with Caval, a lot of it grew out of as you said, you met Peter
yeah,
at an event in Australia. We had a relationship through the technology and through the projects, right?
yeah,
And I think what became very clear the very first time we spoke together as people, you and your colleagues, was that there was a similar kind of perspective. Um, I'd said that index data in many ways, when we started the company, it felt more like we were trying to recreate something akin to the government office that we had left. And I
Yeah.
would say that I feel that index data has a lot of common DNA with a library network.
Yes.
We are interested in the space between libraries. We are interested in facilitating collaboration in different ways. So I think when we spoke, there is sort of a direct sense of like, yeah, we're trying to accomplish the same thing. And the very strong interests that you brought in open source software and collaboration in particular, Sarah, I think just helps cement the idea that, yeah,
Yeah.
we can we can talk. That's a shorthand almost immediately when we get on a call because we think about the world in the same way. And
Yeah.
that's important. And all of any sort of long-standing working relationship that I have had with other organizations have been grounded in that sort of a sense of shared value and a sense of shared direction.
And it's just pure fun, right? Like it's
It's like it's total dopamine rush type thing. I mean, I think that's what we ultimately that's what gets you up in the morning is that it's just fun. It's life affirming.
yeah. So I guess we'll sort of wrap up, but what's what sort of advice would you have for, let's say, startup open source library vendors? How can they make their own mark? Because you've done such a great job with Index Data. What sort of advice would you provide to those vendors?
I think what has one of the things that I think is very important is a certain level of consistency because it takes time to establish yourself as an open source vendor or as a and I guess I say vendor, but the reality is that there are a lot of different ways that you can provide value in that system. And at least for me, I found that if your primary goal is to make a lot of money or create a lot of value right out of the door, this is a very hard way to do it. It's
Yeah.
just been my experience that there's a few companies around that have probably made an enormous amount of money in the open source field, but for most of us, um, not so much.
Yes.
One of the things that I have been struck by over the years is the effect that an open source company, if your IP is all, if your intellectual property all lives in open source software, your value to a potential sort of buyer of your company is quite low.
Yeah.
Whether if there's no moat or there's no proprietary thing you're selling, that lowers any motivation that you might have to get acquired by some larger company. And you have to be okay with that, I think. If your goal is to build a company and sell it to somebody else for a bunch of money, this is a difficult way to do that.
Yeah.
Um, but if you are interested in kind of making an honest living, working with other people about stuff that you care about, I think it can be really great. And if you
Yeah.
are launching a new initiative with other people, you have to think about, hey, we make this thing, what's the cost of maintenance? What sort of money do
Yes.
we need to set aside to do new developments? There are things that commercial entities get for free almost, right? Because they can charge a premium for this for the privilege of access to the software that you don't get to charge, but you somehow still
Yeah.
have to figure out how in your community, how in your business do you make room for the creation of new stuff. And that one's always been hard for us because
Yeah. Okay.
I've never really been happy just making the stuff that other people ask me to do. I always had a thing where like I want to have skin in the game. I want to think about like I want to bring my own perspective on
Yes.
the software we make. I want to be in the conversation. But maybe government organizations could do more to help support that type of
Yes.
infrastructure. Like we talk about, there's sort of initiatives like invest in open infrastructure type scenarios where you say, hey, is there some way that we can make it a little bit easier, that we could kind of shift the balance a little bit to make it easier for these things to happen? So there may be a political win that could be had if government were a little bit more supportive of supporting the change that they want to see happen.
Yeah. And just to round things off, and I'm going to throw you in the deep end because I didn't prime you for this, but if you could say something to the Australian libraries, right, because you're now providing this infrastructure to roughly 350 libraries, what would you say to them today?
I guess I would say, I mean, I realize that what we're doing at a certain level is just solving a problem for them. We're just enabling, we're facilitating resource sharing.
Yeah.
And it's just this one slice of what they do. Um, but I would kind of encourage people to also stop and think about the implications of having some of this infrastructure being open and why that's important. And to think about it in the context of the independence of libraries and the ability for libraries to make their own technology choices. And maybe to think about having conversations amongst their peers as well about this stuff, because I think if there is one thing that I find, it is actually really important for libraries to be mindful of the bigger structure that they're part of. And when these types of projects and communities work best, it's when they create a space for us to think about the shape that we want our infrastructure, our community, our industry to have. And I think the fact that Trove is leaning into open standards that gives people the power to choose their own tools, but also an open source project that gives people the power to come in and to participate, uh, that opens up all kinds of doors potentially for engagement. And so I would maybe just encourage people to stop and kind of look at the work we have done with a curious eyes to see kind of the mechanism that made it happen. And there may be something that you and I can do, Sarah, and CAVAL and Index Data can do with Trove as well, some along the way to sort of celebrate some of that, because I think it's so critically important to the functioning and to the health and well-being of a democracy. And I think that we are bringing a point of view with the solution that we offered for Trove of how libraries can achieve scale and economy without giving up everything to a monolithic, commercially vended platform.
With that, thank you so much, Sebastian. It's been amazing.
Oh, it's been a joy, Sarah. Thank you so much.